In your opinion, what are the main aspects that led to the political stability of Ming and Qin China? In what ways was this political stability threatened during this time period? So a lot of people start off by talking about sort of the importance of the transition at the beginning of this time period away from Mongol rule. Of course, the Mongols had conquered China and had been ruling it for a couple hundred years at this point in time, although they had adopted a lot of sort of the Chinese ruling practices and ideology. It was sort of very important for the Chinese after this time period to sort of try to reassert their Chinese identity. The Mongols, for example, had sort of forbidden, sort of Chinese government officials from wearing traditional Chinese clothing. And there was other, obvious sort of cultural differences that the Mongols had brought in and had implemented in their ruling style that the Chinese certainly wanted to sort of return to a lot more of their sort of classic traditional culture. A big part of this was a return to traditional Confucian governing principles. And China had been organized into a large, coherent state for quite a while. Really, they've had different dynasties, but going back to, the 600 BCE or so, there's sort of been a relatively long, stable reign of various dynasties within China that have all utilized the idea of Confucianism and its principles to govern a incredibly large and diverse area which comprises China. And some of these sort of Confucian ideals that they were very much interested in was sort of an ideal of mutual respect between various relationships. So, for example, a father was supposed to sort of look out for his son and do things in the son's best interest, and the son, for his part, was supposed to give sort of unquestioning loyalty to the father. There's a very sort of patriarchal relationship built in between a wife and the husband, where once more the wife was supposed to sort of give unquestioning, undying loyalty to the husband, but the husband was supposed to act in the wife's best interest. And this sort of internal sort of family relationships that were built up were supposed to sort of be mirrored at the national level. So the subjects were supposed to give their undying, unquestioning loyalty to their regional governors and to the emperor. And in return, those government officials and the emperor were supposed to be sort of good caretakers of the people. So certainly it was a governing system made up of these various relationships. It gets much more complicated than that, but that's sort of a broad overview. A really important element then of this Confucian governing model was the importance of highly trained and highly skilled bureaucrats. Because China was essentially the largest population-wise, largest sort of empire on Earth at this point in time, and had been for quite a while, a very intense sort of bureaucracy was necessary to try to keep everything running and working correctly. And China, more than anywhere else on Earth, pioneered this idea of having really highly trained people in those governmental positions to try to make sure everything is going to be moving and working as smoothly as possible. So a big part of this was the civil service exams. They're sort of like, you might think of it the equivalent of getting a PhD in our modern world, where people would be essentially training and studying their entire lives to take this exam. It'd be sort of a very intense 3-day exam where they'd sort of be isolated and they'd only be given water, and they have to write out all these various essays on Confucian thought and principles and so forth. And there'd be different exams also depending on sort of what level you wanted to get to. But in general, it was a very, very complex and intensive examination process, and meant that if you were eventually going to be able to move into that bureaucratic class, you'd have obviously a lot of times for people to be sort of an upward mobility. It would be a very prestigious position within China, but at the same point in time, it meant that you would have had to have worked very hard to get there, and that you would be fairly well trained and very well versed in Confucianism and how to sort of govern a large region with lots of people in it which is very much what they were looking for in the civil service exams. So very much important of trying to reinstall that. Sort of along with the importance of sort of the civil service exam system was that there was a lot of support for scholarship and knowledge, particularly on behalf of the various emperors during this time period. That they certainly wanted to look back and accumulate histories within China. They wanted to make sure that knowledge is being recorded and written down and shared. Travel logs from visiting different lands through the Silk Road were accumulated and compiled into compendiums and volumes. And there was definitely a attempt to try to enhance and expand and record their knowledge. There was also a return to more strict social stratification during this time period. That sort of goes hand in hand, I would say, with those Confucian values, which very much sort of favors a sort of conservative, strict social and sort of personal relationship hierarchy, which was definitely being reinforced during this time period. You can certainly see that in the treatment of women, as women's roles typically declined during this time period. The practice of foot binding was introduced, and in general, women had fewer opportunities and were oftentimes sort of being placed under much tighter controls than they had been prior to this time period. So that's going to be one element that's also going to be sort of reinstating and reinserting itself. As the Mongols came in, they typically had a much more egalitarian view of women. Women, certainly I would say, were socially on the same level as men, but coming from much more of a nomadic, steppeland nomadic culture, it was very much not uncommon for women to be warriors, for women to have very important jobs and roles within society. And certainly that gets transferred in with some of the Mongol ruling ideology, which is one of the things that the Chinese, particularly Chinese men and Chinese politicians, did not like during the Mongol period of Mongol rules. So that certainly gets sort of brought to the other more extreme side after the Chinese are able to retake over. You also see the restoration and expansion of agriculture during this time period, which is going to help boost that very large population that China already had to even new heights and new levels. For example, you see the introduction of new crops from the Americas. Maize, which is essentially corn, sweet potatoes, peanuts. Those are all going to have a large impact on boosting agriculture within China, making sure that China can sustain even higher population levels, which they will certainly be beginning to after this time period. Some people also mentioned Cheng Hu and his voyages of exploration, and how this was just sort of an example of how wealthy and prosperous the Chinese emperor and empire had become, and the fact that they were very much in certain ways being sort of more expansionist than they had in previous eras, at least for about a 20-year period during those voyages. Also, as Europeans became more and more interested in China, remember Europeans had very recently at this point in time begun sailing and navigating and setting up their own sort of trading networks within the Indian Ocean Trade Network, which China was very much sort of one of the anchors of. There was increasing emphasis and desire on the part of Europeans to try to tap into the large population potential markets within China. But economically, China was fairly wary of this, and they definitely wanted to limit European economic influence to a few key ports and a few key areas that they could sort of easily regulate and to keep an eye on. And for the most part, the Europeans at this point in time were very much kept in check. The Chinese were not nearly as wary of European intellectual ideas or religion as, say, the Japanese were, which we'll be talking about in a little while here, because essentially they did not feel like the Europeans were going to be introducing any ideas that were going to be new or revolutionary or causing a stir. And typically those European ideas of religion, whether it was Christianity or European philosophy or science, it made some small inroads into China, but never gained a huge following. And for the most part, there was sort of this prevailing idea of, well, if it's not broken, there's no reason to fix it on the part of the Chinese. And they were very comfortable sort of with their own cultural traditions. So while they were very much wary as far as sort of limiting the economic impacts that Europeans might have, the sort of cultural impacts were more or less just sort of mitigated to a relatively small number of the Chinese population. Of course, during this time period, you'll see a lot of territorial expansion. You see direct control being extended over Mongolia and Tibet. The Chinese army grows very much larger in size and their capability to bring these new locations under their control and control them. You also see the expansion and the introduction of sort of more tribute states like Korea and Vietnam throughout this time period. So certainly the Ming and the Qin dynasties are going to see very much a return to China being the largest, wealthiest, most powerful location on Earth, at least for another couple hundred years here, as they're able to very much sort of rekindle what had worked so well and so successfully for them for hundreds of years. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese are going to be without challenges, as they certainly are. Certainly, you see, I would say that sort of idea of sort of cultural superiority in certain ways sort of works against the Chinese throughout this time period. You see them pulling back on those naval expeditions that Cheng He had been leading, which, while they were very costly, certainly was expanding Chinese influence and power, as making the sea lanes and the trade lanes safer. And after those get pulled back, there really was an uptick in piracy in the region, and it was more difficult to keep those trading lanes open. So while they may have, limited the cost to a certain degree, it cost them in the long run in other ways. But it very much goes back to sort of that idea that China viewed themselves as the central kingdom, that they were sort of the center of the earth, and that everything that was going to be important was going to be happening right there in China. They also want to make sure that they were very well defended against those steppe-land nomadic peoples from Eurasia, such as the Mongols, who had, of course, been victorious over Chinese empires in the past, and they want to make sure that was not going to be happening again. So certainly, they turned to in the later Ming Dynasty and into the Qin Dynasty to a little more isolationist, although that military expansion is going to be a big part that is going to be continuing to expand their borders. But the idea is that sort of that central heartland of China is going to be sort of the most important thing where their focus is going to be. And in the long run, once Europe starts to, particularly after the Industrial Revolution, is finding ways to catch up in the realms of production and so forth, it's going to take the Chinese a while to catch up and to realize that there might be some reforms that are going to be needed in order to sort of keep up with the changing world that is happening around them. But that's something we'll be talking about more in a few weeks here. Of course, some of you also brought up that there were issues with eunuchs in the Ming Dynasty. There was sort of a reliance on them rather than those traditional Chinese bureaucrats, with the idea that eunuchs, since they could not have children, would be more loyal to the emperor because they would not be trying to sort of fight in their own name for their own family lines. And certainly the Chinese put a lot of blame on the eunuchs at this time period, which I think is why it comes down to us. But it seems like the eunuchs were sort of more of scapegoats at this point in time for people who were dissatisfied with the empire and the emperor himself and as a whole, that they wanted to find sort of an easy group to blame, and it seemed like eunuchs were sort of that scapegoat that they could use to try to put the blame for what was going wrong on a group of people who, while they held fairly high status positions in the emperor's court, ultimately didn't have a ton of political sway outside of what they were given by the emperor themselves, which put them in a pretty vulnerable position ultimately. And of course, there's going to be that uptick in piracy, which I noted, which is going to be hampering China's economy, and particularly bringing disaster to some coastal areas. There's natural disasters and famines which are occurring during this time period, peasant revolts, which of course lead eventually to the decline of the Ming and the sort of the Qin dynasty rising to prominence. So those are all going to be challenges that China is going to be facing, but it certainly wasn't unusual for any sort of large imperial system to be facing these kind of challenges throughout this time period. And China is going to navigate it more successfully than most, which is why up until the 1700s, like I said, they're still going to be sort of the center of the cultural, intellectual, economical, and certainly having the highest production levels in the world through this time period. So for our diary question here, I thought the class did a very good job of thinking about how it would have been like living in the Ming or Qin dynasties, and did a pretty good job making some creative uh, uh, entries on sort of taking the information that we learned in the last section about sort of how life had developed and changed during these time periods, and then putting it into much more of a sort of personal perspective. So, some of the people thought about what it might be like to be a person who was either preparing to take the civil service examinations or had already taken them, well, how they thought that might change their lives, um, or how being one of those bureaucrats, what their sort of life was like. Some people also focused on the sort of reinforcing of patriarchy during this time period, and how women felt like they had very little power, sort of how brutal the practice of foot binding was, and how that was negatively impacting a lot of women during this time period. So there was definitely a focus on that in the answers I was reading. There's also focus on the expansion of territory. People imagining what it might be like to be a soldier in the Chinese army. Other people thought more of maybe what it would be like to be a sailor in Zheng Hu's ship, and how that might have felt or looked. What kind of experience that would have been. Other people focus more on sort of the differences in agricultural production. A lot of people said, well, if I was a farmer, this is kind of how my life might have been impacted and changed during this time period. So yeah, there's a really good cross section of all the various ways that China was developing and changing during this time period, and these sort of most important aspects. So I thought the class did a very good job of teasing those and bringing those out. I would like you to choose 3 images or pictures which were displayed in this week's PowerPoint or chapter. Give a brief description of each image and then describe what you think it can tell you about East Asia during this time period, or how the image exemplifies the major themes or elements of early modern East Asia. Um, and yeah, once again, I thought the class did a very good job of picking a good sort of cross section of the resources available. I saw a lot of people putting in the image of the Machuan treasure ship compared to the sort of early European seafaring vessel, kind of showing just sort of how large and advanced the Chinese sailing ships were at this point in time, and how sort of that technology was being utilized compared to the Europeans that were sort of just barely getting their legs under them to a large degree. Their ships were comparatively very, very small, not nearly as stable, and much more sort of haphazard than what you saw with these incredibly large, Chinese sailing ships during this time period. So it sort of shows you how China, because they had been sort of such a large, powerful location for such a long period of time, just sort of compared to Europe that was sort of just getting going at the beginning of our sort of class period here. A lot of people also focused in on some of those Chinese trade goods, the images of the Chinese porcelain, which the Europeans very much sought after, so much for that eventually end up being called China in Europe. So if you think about fine china now, it's still coming from this idea that the Chinese were the ones who really sort of pioneered the creation of this sort of very fine and intricately detailed pottery and glazed pottery vessels. There's also the images from the book of sort of the women pouring tea and weaving silk, and how tea and silk were also two of the primary trade goods that Europeans and other people around the Indian Ocean Trade Network were very much interested in trading with the Chinese to bring those goods into their own country. And oftentimes China was making themselves very rich importing gold and silver for these more manufactured goods. A lot of people also pointed to more of the architecture of the time period, the construction and building of the Forbidden City under the Ming Dynasty, of course, also the Hall of Supreme Harmony being created during this time period. Shows that there was definitely a uptick in sort of monumental construction. The Great Wall was also represented in a lot of people's pictures. And even though the Great Wall, as we sometimes think of it, really is not all that historically accurate, it was more sort of a continuous line of sort of forts, and there were some portions that might have looked somewhat similar to what we think of as the Great Wall, but typically it would have been a lot more sort of spread out and sporadic. But very, very long history of it. It really goes back to the third, fourth century BCE or so. So yeah, very good job with sort of those architecture and some of the images of sort of the structures that make China so unique, and really also sort of show the wealth and power that was present in these dynasties. Also showing the wealth and power of the dynasties, people pointed out the images of the emperors, how they're always wearing sort of very elaborate clothes, and definitely that those clothes sort of showed the power and prestige of their position. I also really liked the people brought in the images of the city of Cathay. How there was a lot of those series of those images there that really sort of show what a sort of bustling, prosperous city it was, with all sorts of trade coming in via ship, via land, all sorts of shops and residencies in this location. It really kind of gives you an idea of a very sort of thriving port city, and how that's just one example of numerous cities across China, really showing why it was sort of the industrious kind of center at this point in time. A lot of people also pointed out the arches in honor of unmarried widows as sort of an example of how architecture can be seen to resemble sort of the patriarchal structure which was created during this time period, how people whose husbands had died were being encouraged to not remarry and try to sort of stay faithful to their husbands even if their husbands had passed on or were dead. And people also brought up the image of sort of the irrigation device. You can see a few men sort of on like a treadmill type thing, putting water and getting water to flow into the fields. And it seemed like a pretty ingenious device, but something that would take a lot of work. And that ultimately gets back to, first of all, why China was the largest producer in the world at this point in time, because in a pre-industrial society, pretty much the only way to increase production output was to increase the amount of people working. It was pretty much just to increase man hours, and because China had that very large population, they were essentially able to increase their production exponentially. But a lot of times it took really a lot of hard work, as that picture demonstrates. There's also the picture of the people sort of pulling the boat down the river, and things that you think, there might be an easier way to go about doing this. The Chinese didn't necessarily have to innovate more effective ways of production because they had always sort of had enough manpower to get done what they needed to do. Of course, that's going to be changing during the time period of the Industrial Revolution, where Europeans eventually try to figure out a way to break this mold, where no longer is population going to be directly tied to production. There's now going to be new ways to try to increase production without having to directly correlatorily increase the size of your population. And once more, that's going to be one of the reasons why China is going to find themselves in a position where they're going to need to adapt, because they had been so reliant upon just having such a large population and having that correlate to a very strong level of production for such a long period of time. It definitely is going to take a mental shift, so to speak, on the part of the Chinese to start realizing that if they want to keep up with the way that the world is moving, that they're going to have to make a few revisions here or there. And that's, of course, going to be a topic that'll be coming up later on in the semester as well. All right, taking a look at the word clouds that people comprise. I'm not going to get into all of the various words that you could have used here, but just want to cover some of the more common ones that I saw propping up and sort of go through how that relates to this period of the unification of Japan. First of all, a lot of people sort of had the position of the emperor as being important, as an important term. The emperors traditionally within Japan had held relatively a limited amount of power. They were almost more of kind of a figurehead, with the shogunate or the shoguns being a more powerful force. They were sort of the military leaders of the empire and sort of did things on his behalf to a certain degree. But as time went on, these shoguns gained sort of more power, began fighting and competing against one another, which led to the Sengoku period, which is sort of this period of large-scale civil war across the island of Japan, until eventually Tokugawa Tokugawa Ieyasu is able to pretty much beat out his rivals and gain control and sort of reestablish his role as the sort of a new version of the Emperor of Japan, a position that's no longer going to be a figurehead, but is going to have much more direct political control. And to sort of accomplish this and sort of change this perspective, they feel like a few things are needed. First of all, is a reliance on Neo-Confucianism, which I saw a lot of people having in their word clouds as well. The fact that they're sort of taking these ideas of the Confucian bureaucratic state, which had worked so well in China, and beginning to implement them in Japan. And certainly they are modifying them to sort of fit with Japanese traditions and culture. But there's this idea that there should be sort of a powerful bureaucratic state apparatus in place, rather than just sort of having these various sort of more regional lords sort of all doing their own thing, was a pretty new and novel idea. To that point, there was certainly a degree of trying to rein in the daimyo, which were sort of these large, powerful regional lords. You know, almost think of them as sort of these large, sort of noble clans or families that controlled the vast amount of sort of the land and the wealth within Japan. And the new shogunates wanted to find ways to then bring that power under their own belt, under the new sort of imperial structure as well. So those are some of the most sort of common terms that I heard from this time period, which I think certainly are pretty emblematic of how the political structure of Japan starts to change and starts to become much more unified with one sort of more powerful voice moving forward from the 1600s up into the 1900s, where you start seeing once more sort of a new realm of pretty drastic changes, which is going to alter the course of the island and its people. How do the Japanese balance their own cultural traditions with the presence of new ideas from China and Europe? What aspects led to the decision whether to incorporate new ideas or reject them? And really looking at this question, a lot of it comes down to those recent political changes that we talked about in Japan. The rise of the shogun, the importance of trying to prevent civil unrest and disorder and maintain a more sort of unified political state. And most of the time what you see is anything that they perceive as being sort of a danger or a threat to that political unity is going to be something that they are going to very sort of harshly reject and cast out. And anything that they perceive as potentially aiding or benefiting it is going to be something that they are going to be much more willing to adopt. So, for example, the incorporation of Neo-Confucianism is a great example of how the Japanese were more than willing, at least the government and the shogunate were more than willing to incorporate those ideas because, of course, China was very much built on a model of sort of respect and legitimization for the government, for the emperor, for the people at the very top, and how sort of the other more sort of regional areas of Japan were supposed to be sort of giving their loyalty and allegiance to that more sort of centralized government. So the ideas of Neo-Confucianism very, very popular with the government, and they were more than willing to try to incorporate those. Also, of course, Chinese is going to be not just sort of becoming sort of the ruling ideology that Japan is going to use, but also Chinese language and literature are going to be very important as well. On a religious level, Buddhism, which of course had been sort of imported first from India via the Silk Road to China, then from China became very popular there, spread to Japan. So religiously, it's also going to be relatively popular within Japan. Of course, Japan is also going to have a large population of people who practice sort of traditional Japanese religion or Shintoism. Is still going to be very popular. But just like Buddhism never really had in a lot of ways, it's not an exclusionary religion. So, for example, if you look at China, China had Confucianism, it had Taoism, and it had Buddhism, all sort of operating within its bounds at the same point in time. So Buddhism was had no issue with um, sort of combining with other religions and sort of fulfilling different religious or spiritual needs that people had. So there were plenty of people in Japan who practiced both Buddhism and Shintoism at the same point in time. Not everyone within Japanese society, of course, was comfortable with this. There was that sort of emphasis by some on native learning, who wanted to sort of cast out or cast doubt on any sort of literature or religion that originated outside of Japan. But typically, those were not people at sort of the very top levels of the Japanese government, which is why those elements that did seem sort of beneficial or at least not threatening to the stability of Japan were pretty much sort of allowed to thrive. The biggest regulation that you see was contact between Japanese and people from the outside, with the government issuing very sort of strict regulations on its own people, saying that they could not trade, or they could not travel to other countries, they could not build ships over a certain size, so it'd be harder to cross or navigate across the ocean. And trying to very much regulate what kind of contact the Japanese were going to be having with outsiders. And particularly, this was going to be leveled at Europeans. Wanted to make sure there wasn't going to be too much European influence. And to a certain degree, this was a fairly smart strategy on the part of the Japanese. We've seen in a lot of locations what ended up happening once the Europeans sort of ended up having wholesale access to a location. The Japanese themselves looked to the Philippines as an example and saw that the Spanish had essentially come in first as traders, then as missionaries, and soon ended up sort of conquering the entire island chain and were sort of maintaining it as their own colony. We already saw what happened in the Americas, and pretty much, the sense was that everywhere the Europeans could essentially get enough power and hold to take over, they would. So it wasn't necessarily a terribly it was a relatively intelligent idea, I would say, on the part of the Japanese government to be very skeptical and cautious of the Europeans that they were interacting with. So even still, through these time periods of very harsh sort of regulations on contact and travel, there was still a limited amount of contact that was allowed between particularly Chinese and Dutch merchants. The Japanese always maintained some relationship with the Dutch, particularly because the Dutch seemed less interested in religious conversions and so forth than just sort of simply sort of strict trading and so forth, at least in the area of Japan. So that might have been one of the reasons why they were more willing to still have some contact, even if it was in a limited capacity, with Dutch merchants and representatives. Early on, before these edicts were passed, there was some activity to convert people within Japan to Christianity, and much more than China, Christianity took off in Japan to the degree where the government started to perceive it as a threat, and that's where you start seeing them also sort of cracking down very hard on the spread of Christianity, making essentially outlawed, persecuting and killing anyone who had converted, trying to essentially ban any priests from trying to convert people on the island, attacking and killing them if they could. And this was certainly much more of, I'd say, a political move than a religious move. Of course, there had already been an example of sort of multiple religions being allowed within Japan with Buddhism and Shintoism. But really, this was an attempt to try to make sure that there wasn't going to be a potential alliance between those sort of powerful regional lords, the daimyo, and Europeans. That was sort of the biggest risk that the government saw in the spread of Christianity, that they thought that there could be some of the more regional lords could use it to get more trading advantage with the Europeans, bring in more weapons from the Europeans, get in potentially support militarily from the Europeans, and that could be definitely a link to a alliance against them. And that's what they wanted to present, which is one of the reasons why they were really so forceful in and cracking down and trying to stamp it out throughout their island. Like I said, there was still going to be plenty of contact kept, particularly with the Chinese, where you do start seeing, like I said, language, culture, religion, being and constantly sort of spreading from one to the other. Eventually, Korea is going to be another trading partner with Japan as time goes on, and other Southeast Asian kingdoms are going to be included in this. For the European side, primarily it's going to be the Dutch, like I said, are going to be the ones who are primarily the contact with the Japanese. And the Japanese are particularly going to be interested in sort of the Dutch contact to that sort of new science that Europe was developing. Um, Medicine, botany, astronomy. These are all going to be things that the Japanese figure, hey, we can use these, we can utilize these. This is interesting to us, but from the government standpoint, it could only strengthen Japan. It's not going to sort of undermine anything or threaten their own power. So once more, the biggest aspects that sort of led to the decision whether to incorporate new ideas or reject them was the perceived threat or lack thereof to sort of that primary goal of keeping Japan unified under sort of one centralized government. So going over our primary sources for this week. Um, Looking at question number 1 here, what reasons does Cheng Hu give for the great voyages the Chinese had undertaken? What similarities do you notice between the voyages of Cheng Hu and those of European explorers we learned about the past few weeks? What are their differences? So starting off for number 1, and what reasons does Cheng Hu give in his document, or in this document? The first is obviously the idea of wanting to promote China's greatness. That's one of the main reasons for these fleets to be launched. For example, he says in the very first passage, the Imperial Ming Dynasty unifying seas and continents, surpassing the 3 dynasties, even goes beyond the Han and the Tang dynasties. So trying to say that the Ming Dynasty is trying to sort of unify the seas and the people, and that's sort of this great undertaking that is surpassing even these other sort of previous great iterations of Chinese dynasties that came before. He also goes on to say, thus the barbarians from beyond the sea, though their countries are truly distant, have come to audience bearing precious objects and presents. And this gets to a couple of different things. First of all, the Chinese are certainly considering the people beyond their borders barbarians, sort of in the same way that Europeans are to the second portion of this question. But that's still, he's saying, focusing more on the exchange aspect of it, that seeing sort of the might and the power of the Chinese, that these other kingdoms and people were willing to bring precious objects and gifts. And certainly it wasn't a one-side exchange, right? The Chinese wanted this to go both ways. For example, he goes on to say that the Chinese wanted to confer presents on them in order to make it happen, the transforming power of the imperial virtue, and to treat distant peoples with kindness. So trying to show that the Chinese has a sort of imperial virtue and power by generally treating the people with kindness and by giving them lots of gifts. So definitely still the main goal showing sort of China's greatness and power, but doing that by sort of showing how generous China is. But China is not always simply coming as trying to being a benevolent sort of benefactor here, right? The idea of wanting to have these trade ships control and establish trade was also very important, particularly in places that were not necessarily very welcoming to the Chinese. For example, he says, "We arrived in the distant countries, we captured alive those of the native kings who were not respectful, and exterminated those barbarian robbers who engaged in piracy, so that consequently the sea routes would be cleansed and pacified." So there was conflict and there was warfare on these voyages. There were a very large military contingent, which was a part of these voyages, and that typically this was used to sort of show the might and power of the Chinese dynasty to these foreign lands. But if necessary, if they thought that China's trade interests were not being served well, or there were pirates, the Chinese were more than willing to try to force those trade routes to be opened up and available to them. So another big reason for these voyages, the establishment and of sort of trade that's going to be beneficial to the Chinese. So what comparisons can we see between these sort of voyages of the Chinese and those of early European explorers? I think a lot of people touched on this, that there was a very similar perception of superiority, right, of cultural superiority, where you have sort of both the Europeans and their contact with American Indians, or with Africans or with those in Southeast Asia, that they always sort of viewed their own culture and their own religion as being superior. And certainly that sort of tone of superiority comes across in this document by Cheng He as well. Um, at the same point in time, though, I think you have to look at their goals being very different and where they're starting from at the beginning of this being very different. China was coming from it from a position of already having a lot of wealth, a lot of might, a lot of power. So they weren't necessarily worried about accumulating more of it. It was more about demonstrating what they already had. Whereas Europeans, their main goal was trying to gain more wealth and might and power. They wanted to use their voyages as a way of collecting and accumulating more of that for themselves, as opposed to just sort of demonstrating it to the people they were coming in contact with. And this ultimately is going to lead to Europeans, of course, oftentimes choosing to be conquerors, to enslaving populations, to much more violent interactions between them and the other cultures they're coming into contact with. Whereas with China, even though that does happen occasionally, quite often China's main goals is that they are more apt to be trading with people, to be exchanging with people, and to be having much more sort of peaceful interactions. And certainly at the end of this time period, as opposed to sort of expanding on a global level like Europe is going to do, China actually retracts and sort of re-centralizes themselves around their land-based empire and forgoes a large sort of military presence in the seas and in the surrounding areas. So the end result of both of the expeditions is very distinct as well. So going on, looking at our second document, how are the Japanese attempting to isolate themselves from foreign influences? And the first attempt is really self-isolation, trying to make sure that the Japanese aren't going to be venturing out and making a lot of contact with people outside of Japan. So for example, one edict simply says Japanese ships are strictly forbidden to leave for foreign countries. So that's pretty clear cut and pretty straightforward. And then on the reverse side, it also says if any Japanese returns from overseas after residing there, he must be put to death. So any one from Japan who had left and was residing in a foreign country, if they try to come back, they're essentially going to be killed, and very hard for anyone to go out, gain any knowledge of the outside world, and bring it back into Japan. So very much sort of self-isolation becomes a big part of these edicts that we are seeing, and a big part of trying to keep Japan relatively insular during this period. You also see a lot of trade regulations. For example, no single trading city shall be permitted to purchase all the merchandise brought by foreign ships. So trying to make sure that these ships are going to have to go to multiple ports and interact with multiple locations. Another example, after setting the price, all white yarns brought by foreign ships shall be allocated to the 5 trading cities and other quarters as stipulated. So stipulating where trade can go, how much any one port or any one city can engage in this trade and this commerce. So very much trying to regulate the trade that does come in. Another big part that a lot of people pointed out was the exclusion of Christianity, right? We already talked about in our reflection activities how Christianity was seen as sort of a threat to the Tokugawa government, and this very much sort of depicts that. For example, they say you are not permitted to let priests or those who believe in their preaching to come aboard your ships. So trying to make sure that there's a strict difference between Christians and the Japanese people. Going on, if you believe in that religion, band together in an attempt to do evil things, they must be subjected to punishment. So trying to make sure if anyone is a Christian and is trying to spread their religion or do other things that the government would be perceiving here as evil, that they are going to be punished. And definitely trying to make sure that the government knows about it. For example, any informer revealing the whereabouts or the followers of priests must be rewarded accordingly. And then it goes on to sort of list the rewards that they would receive. So trying to make sure that they're keeping a very strict eye on the spread of religion within their territory. And we already sort of talked about to a certain degree how this was very much tied in with wanting to make sure that groups within Japan could not ally themselves with foreign powers against the Tokugawa government. Also, there was a contingent of strict European exclusion in this, particularly focused on the Portuguese. So after it sort of recounts how these sort of Catholic priests had been making problems. It says, in view of the above, hereafter entry by the Portuguese Golota, essentially ships, is forbidden. If they insist on coming to Japan, the ships must be destroyed and anyone aboard those ships must be beheaded. So very sort of strict regulations here, making sure that these people that the Japanese are viewing as a foreign threat are going to be very sort of harshly dealt with. So moving on to number 3, during the early modern period, both Chinese and Japanese experimented with policies of expansion and isolation. What factors do you see as leading to the presence of these competing ideas? And once more, we already sort of touched on these in both the documents and our reflection activities. But getting back to China, it always seemed to come down to this idea of the central kingdom, this idea that China was sort of the most significant location on the planet, and either they wanted to show that through expansion and these large trading fleets and military expansion to the surrounding area, or they wanted, or sort of made the argument that because China is sort of the central kingdom and the only real location that matters, we don't need to have far-flung colonies, or we don't need to try to spread Chinese culture to the entire Indian Ocean basin or anything like that. They were more or less content to try to preserve a strong centralized state within China and didn't feel the same need that, for example, Europeans are going to be doing at this point in time to sort of spread that culture outwards. On the side of the Japanese, it really comes down to being favorable of expansion and the incorporation of new ideas when it is going to be in service of a strong centralized government, and trying to forbid and be very critical and isolationist for anything that they view might be harming the control or authority of that central government. So those are really sort of the main ideas that sort of lead to both these locations. On the one hand, seeming to expand or incorporate foreign elements and foreign ideas, while at the same time also trying to sort of turn against them, or not being interested in them, or not necessarily wanting them to be part of the culture and the changes which are happening in both those locations.